The room was dark, with only a faint glow from the streetlights slipping through the blinds. A man sat at the edge of the bed, motionless, staring at the floor. His name was Robert Kent. To the outside world, he was an ordinary man, a devoted husband, a loving father. But beneath the surface, there was a secret, a chilling, calculated secret. The clock ticked louder than usual, or so it seemed. Robert's heart raced, but his face remained calm. He heard the creak of the floorboards above. His wife, Linda, was still awake. He couldn't afford a mistake tonight. He stood smoothing his shirt, adjusting his tie. In the mirror, his reflection stared back, a mask of confidence, concealing a storm beneath. The briefcase sat by the door, precisely packed. It held no papers, no contracts, only lies. He glanced at the clock. Midnight. It was time. Robert walked out into the crisp night air. The suburban street was silent, almost unnaturally so. Every step echoed, sharp against the pavement. He reached his car, a modest sedan, unremarkable. Opening the trunk, he checked the contents. A phone, a passport, a loaded gun. The chill bit at his skin, but he didn't flinch. Everything was ready. He drove in silence, the hum of the engine steady. The city lights blurred as he sped down the highway. Each turn was precise, rehearsed. The meeting spot was a dimly lit warehouse. Its looming structure cast eerie shadows on the ground. Inside, the air smelled of oil and rust. The flickering fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. Two men were waiting, their faces shrouded in darkness. Robert approached, his steps deliberate. One man spoke. His voice was cold, sharp. "Do you have it?" Robert nodded, handing over the briefcase. The man opened it, inspecting its contents. His expression changed, a flicker of suspicion. Robert's heart pounded, but he didn't show it. Then came the sound. A car screeched outside. Doors slammed. Red and blue lights flashed through the cracks in the walls. FBI agents stormed in, shouting commands. The men froze, panic spreading across their faces. But Robert didn't move. He smirked, calm, collected. He raised his hands slowly, surrendering. "Gentlemen," he said, his voice steady. The warehouse erupted in chaos. Agents swarmed in, weapons raised, barking orders. The two men beside Robert lunged for their guns. Too late. Red laser dots painted their chests. "Drop it," a voice thundered. They hesitated. A single shot rang out. One of them crumpled, his body hitting the cold concrete with a sickening thud. The other man fell to his knees, hands trembling in surrender. But Robert? He stood still, unshaken, almost amused. An agent rushed forward, grabbing his arm. "Robert Kent, you are under arrest." Handcuffs clicked shut around his wrists. Cold steel, snug against his skin. He didn't resist, didn't fight. Instead, he laughed, a quiet, eerie chuckle. The lead agent, a hardened man named Detective Miller, narrowed his eyes. "What's so funny?" Robert tilted his head, a smirk tugging at his lips. "You think you caught me," he said, his voice unervingly calm. Miller yanked him forward. "We did?" Robert sighed, shaking his head. "Did you?" A beat of silence. Then, boom! The ground shook violently. A deafening explosion tore through the air. Flames erupted outside. The warehouse doors blasted open by the force. Agents ducked, shielding themselves as debris rained down. Smoke billowed in thick, suffocating waves. Robert stood in the chaos, completely still. Miller coughed, regaining his footing. "What the hell was that?" Robert's smirk widened. "Plan B." Through the smoke, shadows moved. More men, armed, prepared. A black SUV screeched to a halt outside, doors flying open. Robert turned to Miller, his expression unreadable. "You never had me," he whispered. Then, in a blur, his captors were pulled away. Gunfire erupted. Agents fired back, but Robert was already moving, slipping into the SUV. Tires screeched. The vehicle roared into the night, disappearing into the smoke. The FBI had planned everything. They had surrounded the place. They had studied him, tracked him. And yet, Robert Kent was gone. "It's been a pleasure." The black SUV tore through the empty streets, its tires screeching against the asphalt. Inside, Robert sat calmly, adjusting his cuffs as if nothing had happened. Across from him, a man in a black suit reloaded his weapon. "You cut it close," Robert muttered, glancing out the window. The city lights blurred past, sirens wailing somewhere in the distance. The driver, a muscular man with a scar down his jaw, smirked through the rearview mirror. "You told us to wait until the last second." Robert chuckled, shaking his head. "True, but I wasn't expecting Miller to be that fast." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a silver cigarette case. Flipping it open, he revealed a tiny flash drive hidden inside. A small, insignificant thing, but powerful enough to bring down men in high places. That was why the FBI had come for him. Not for petty fraud, not for money laundering, but for what he knew. The secrets he carried. Secrets that could set the world on fire. The SUV took a sharp turn, heading toward the outskirts of the city. Robert glanced at the driver. "Where to now?" The man didn't answer immediately. Instead, he pulled onto a secluded road, the headlights cutting through the thick fog. "We have a plane ready. You'll be in Argentina by morning." Robert exhaled, leaning back against the leather seat. "Good. Very good." He tapped the cigarette case against his knee, deep in thought. Everything was going according to plan. Everything, until the first bullet shattered the back windshield. Glass exploded inward, spraying across the seats. The driver cursed, swerving violently. "Hold on." Robert barely had time to react before another shot struck the tire. The SUV spun out of control, skidding off the road. The world flipped, metal screeching as the car rolled. Once, twice, then silence. Smoke curled from the wreckage. A single headlight flickered, barely holding on. Inside, Robert groaned, blood trickling from his forehead. His vision blurred, the world tilting. Boots crunched against gravel. Men, closing in. A shadow loomed over the broken windshield, a gun aimed directly at his face. Then a familiar voice. Calm, cold. "You didn't really think you could fool the FBI, did you?" "Detective Miller." Robert laughed. Even as pain laced his ribs. "Guess you got me," he rasped. Miller tilted his head, eyes narrowing. "Not yet." He raised his gun and fired. Pain. Sharp. Immediate. Robert gasped as the bullet tore through his shoulder. His body jerked back against the twisted metal, heat radiating from the wound. Blood soaked into his shirt, warm and sticky. Miller stepped closer, his silhouette framed by the flickering headlight. Gun still raised. Expression unreadable. "You're not dying yet," he said, voice steady. Robert grit his teeth, forcing himself to breathe through the pain. The other agents moved in, weapons drawn, securing the wreck. The driver was dead. The man in the back seat gone, vanished into the night. Robert smirked despite the agony. "Missed one," he rasped. Miller didn't flinch. "You always have an escape plan, don't you?" Robert coughed, the taste of iron filling his mouth. "Wouldn't be here if I didn't." Miller crouched, gripping Robert's collar. "Then tell me, what's on the drive?" His eyes flicked to the silver cigarette case, still clutched in Robert's bloody fingers. "You went through all this trouble for something. What is it?" Robert exhaled, slow and deliberate. For the first time, his smirk faded. "You don't want to know," he whispered. Miller's grip tightened. "I decide that." Robert stared at him for a long moment. The sounds of distant sirens crept through the night. Time was running out. For both of them. Then Robert did something unexpected. He smiled, and before Miller could react, he clenched his fist. Crack! The cigarette case shattered in his palm. The tiny flash drive crushed beyond repair. Miller's eyes widened. Robert let out a breathless chuckle. "Game over," he whispered. Silence. Then Miller's jaw tensed. "You just signed your death sentence." Robert winced, feeling the weight of his mistake. Or was it a mistake? His vision blurred, darkness creeping in. As he slipped into unconsciousness, one last thought echoed in his mind. Had he won? Or had he finally lost? Darkness. Heavy. Suffocating. Then pain. A sharp, searing jolt in his shoulder. Robert gasped awake, his body instinctively jerking against restraints. leather straps, tight, binding his wrists to a steel chair. His head lolled to the side, vision hazy. A single light bulb buzzed overhead, casting harsh shadows against concrete walls. Basement. Cold. Damp. Somewhere off the grid. Not an FBI holding cell. This was different. Footsteps. Slow. Deliberate. Then a familiar voice. "You really thought that was the end, didn't you?" Miller. Standing in the doorway, sleeves rolled up, knuckles bruised. No badge. No backup. Just him. Robert licked his cracked lips, tasting blood. "Didn't expect you to go rogue," he murmured. Miller chuckled, but there was no humor in it. "You destroyed the drive," he said, pacing in front of Robert. "Do you have any idea what that cost me?" Robert's mind was sluggish, but pieces started falling into place. Miller wasn't here for justice. He was here for himself. The drive had secrets, not just about criminals, but about people in power, maybe even about Miller. Robert tilted his head, despite the pain. "Let me guess," he muttered. "You weren't just trying to arrest me." Miller stopped, hands flexing into fists. "You had information that could have burned everything down." His voice was low. "Dangerous. And now it's gone." Robert smirked, despite the pounding in his skull. "So now what?" he rasped. "You kill me? Make it look like an accident." Miller didn't answer. Instead, he reached into his pocket, pulled out a small scalpel, turned it between his fingers, watching the dim light glint off the blade. Robert's stomach twisted. Miller wasn't in a hurry. This wasn't an interrogation. This was personal. And for the first time in years, Robert Kent felt fear. The scalpel gleamed in Miller's hand. Thin, precise. Not a weapon of rage. A tool of control. Robert swallowed hard, forcing his breath to steady. "Listen," he rasped, his voice raw. "You think I was the only one with that information?" Miller's fingers tightened around the blade. Robert saw the flicker of hesitation. "Good." A crack in the armor. He leaned forward as much as the restraints allowed. "You kill me, and my insurance policy kicks in?" Miller's jaw clenched. "Lies." Robert gave a weak chuckle, wincing at the pain in his ribs. "You sure about that?" Silence stretched between them. Outside, the wind howled through unseen cracks. The basement smelled of damp concrete and old metal. Somewhere, water dripped in slow, steady beats. Robert let it sit, let the uncertainty fester. Then he spoke again, voice softer. "You've got bigger problems than me now." Miller's eyes darkened. "Why?" Robert smiled, teeth stained red. "Because if I disappear, someone will know." Miller didn't move, didn't blink. But Robert saw it, a shadow of doubt creeping into his expression. He pressed on. "You think I didn't prepare for this? You think I didn't leave breadcrumbs?" Miller exhaled through his nose, shifting his stance. The scalpel lowered, just slightly. Then, a knock. Loud, sharp. 3 distinct raps against the metal door. Miller turned, eyes narrowing. No one was supposed to know they were here. Robert's pulse quickened. The knock came again. Miller stepped back, gaze flicking between Robert and the door. Then a voice. Muffled. Unfamiliar. "Detective, we need to talk." Miller stiffened. Robert smiled. His insurance policy had just arrived. Miller's grip on the scalpel tightened. His jaw twitched, muscles working beneath his skin. The knock came again, more forceful this time. "Open the door, Miller." The voice was calm, steady, but there was an edge to it. A warning. Robert watched Miller's hesitation, his pulse pounding in his ears. Whoever was outside wasn't just another cop. They had authority, power, and Miller knew it. He took a slow breath, his hand shifting toward his holster. Robert chuckled weakly. "Bad time for visitors?" Miller shot him a look. Then, without a word, he strode to the door. The lock clicked. The heavy metal creaked open. And there he was, a man in a black suit, tie loosened just enough to show confidence. His eyes sharp, calculating. FBI, but not just any agent. Someone higher up, someone Miller hadn't expected. "Agent Dawson," Miller muttered. A flicker of unease crossed his face. Dawson stepped inside, gaze sweeping over the room. His eyes landed on Robert. Bloodied, restrained, the scalpel still glinting in Miller's grip. A slow smirk played on Dawson's lips. Well, he said, closing the door behind him. This is interesting. Miller straightened, trying to regain control. This isn't what it looks like. Dawson raised an eyebrow. Oh, because it looks like you were about to carve up a federal fugitive in an unmarked basement. Robert grinned through the pain. Nice to meet you, by the way. Dawson ignored him, stepping closer to Miller. Voice low. You really screwed up, Miller? Miller's fingers twitched. Robert saw it. That tiny moment of panic. You don't understand, Miller muttered. Dawson leaned in. No, you don't understand. A pause. Then Dawson pulled something from his pocket. A flash drive. Untouched. Intact. Robert's breath hitched. Miller's eyes widened. Dawson smirked. You really thought he only had one copy? Silence. Thick. Suffocating. Miller's entire body tensed. Then, he moved. Fast. Reaching for his gun. But Dawson was faster. A single shot rang out. Miller staggered, eyes wide in shock. His gun clattered to the floor. Blood bloomed across his shirt. He swayed, then dropped, dead before he hit the ground. Dawson exhaled, slipping his gun back into its holster. Then he turned to Robert. Expression unreadable. You and I need to talk. Robert swallowed. The real game was just beginning. Dawson stepped forward, his polished shoes clicking against the concrete. Robert felt his pulse hammering in his throat. Miller's body lay slumped on the floor, a pool of blood slowly spreading. The room smelled of iron, of sweat, of something final. Dawson knelt beside Robert, tilting his head slightly. You really made a mess of things, Kent. Robert let out a breathless chuckle, shifting against the restraints. Yeah, old habits. Dawson smirked, but there was no humor in it. He reached into his jacket, pulled out a small key, and with a single flick, the leather straps around Robert's wrists snapped open. Relief flooded his limbs, but he didn't move. Not yet. Dawson straightened, sliding the flash drive between his fingers. You were willing to die for this, he mused. Robert flexed his numb fingers. Not die. Just make sure the right people didn't get it. Dawson laughed, low and knowing. That's the problem, Kent. He tossed the drive onto the table, letting it land with a sharp clink. You don't even know who the right people are. Robert's stomach twisted. Something about the way Dawson said it. Calm. Too calm. He sat up slowly, rubbing his wrists. What do you want? Dawson's expression didn't change. You, Robert. A pause. Then, you're going to work for us now. Robert frowned, muscles tensing. Us? Dawson smiled. But his eyes? Cold. You think the FBI were the only ones watching? The weight of his words sank deep into Robert's chest. He glanced at Miller's body, at the gun still warm in Dawson's holster. The execution had been clean, precise. Not a man cleaning up loose ends. A man shifting the game in his favor. Robert exhaled slowly. He had survived the FBI, survived Miller. But now he was in the hands of something much, much worse. Robert swallowed hard. The air in the basement felt heavier now. Dawson stood there, perfectly still, watching him, assessing, calculating. Robert had spent years fooling people, lying, manipulating, staying 10 steps ahead. But this time, he wasn't the one in control. His fingers curled into fists. You expect me to just say yes? Dawson chuckled. Expect? No. But you will? Robert forced a smirk. And if I don't? Dawson sighed, almost disappointed. Then he stepped aside, gesturing toward the door. Then you're free to go. Robert blinked. Too easy. Too clean. He pushed himself up, his legs weak beneath him. Blood still oozed from his shoulder, staining his torn shirt. Dawson just watched, waiting. Robert took a cautious step forward. Then another. His heart pounded. His instinct screamed. He reached the door, fingers grazing the handle. Then, Dawson spoke again. Before you go, you should know something. Robert didn't turn, didn't move, but every nerve in his body was on edge. Dawson's voice was calm, controlled. As of 20 minutes ago, your bank accounts have been frozen. Robert's stomach dropped. Dawson continued. Your offshore holdings? Seized. A slow breath. And your safe houses? Compromised. Robert's grip on the door tightened. Dawson's tone remained casual, almost amused. Oh, and your wife. Robert spun around. Cold rage flared in his chest. Don't. Dawson smirked. There he is. Robert's mind raced. How? How had they moved so fast? He had contingencies, escape routes, emergency funds. But now, he had nothing. Dawson stepped closer. You have no money, no backup, and nowhere to run. Robert's breath came sharp and uneven. Dawson leaned in slightly. But work for us? His voice dropped to a whisper. And you get it all back. Silence stretched. Long, heavy. Robert's jaw clenched. He had always been the one with the upper hand. Always. But this time, he was trapped. Completely. Dawson smiled, knowing he had won. So, Robert, he picked up the flash drive, turned it between his fingers. Are you in? Robert's mind raced as Dawson's words hung in the air. The weight of the decision settled on his shoulders, suffocating. Every escape plan he had ever devised, every backup he had set in motion, was now useless. His hands trembled, though he didn't show it. Dawson's smile widened, as if he could sense Robert's internal battle. Time's ticking, Kent. Your life, as you knew it, is gone. Robert's gaze flickered to the flash drive on the table. It had been his last card, his last hope. But now, Dawson's world had just become Robert's. The realization hit him like a punch to the gut. He was stuck. He had no choice. He closed his eyes, taking a slow breath. Fine, he muttered, the word tasting bitter on his tongue. Dawson's eyes gleamed with satisfaction. You'll be working with us now. Robert met his gaze. And if I refuse? Dawson's expression darkened for a moment. You really think you can outrun me again? He gestured to the door. Your wife is still a variable, Kent. We can make her disappear as easily as you vanished. Robert's heart skipped a beat. He was silent for a moment. Then, barely above a whisper, he asked, What do you want me to do? Dawson leaned forward, his eyes never leaving Robert's. Everything, he said simply. Robert's mind reeled, but he knew better than to ask for specifics now. He had been outplayed, and now his fate was in Dawson's hands. The agent's voice softened, almost gentle. We need someone on the inside, someone who knows how the criminal world thinks. Robert's lips parted, the shock still settling in. You're asking me to turn on everything I've ever built. Dawson nodded. Exactly. The words seemed to hang in the air, thick with meaning. Robert had been a master of the game for so long. But now, he was the pawn. Your first task, Dawson continued, his voice cold, is simple. He reached into his jacket again and pulled out a folder, tossing it onto the table between them. Inside that folder is a list of people who can help us take down a powerful syndicate. They're your next target. Your next job. Robert stared at the folder, its contents still hidden. He could feel his pulse pounding in his neck. His chest tightened. Was this his end? Or a twisted new beginning? He didn't know. But he knew one thing for certain. The life he had once controlled was now gone. And in its place, a darker, far more dangerous game awaited. Robert's fingers hovered over the folder. His mind reeled, trying to make sense of it. The game had changed. He wasn't the player anymore. He was the piece. Dawson's gaze never wavered. You'll find your instructions inside, he said. Your target list is at the top. The syndicate you'll infiltrate. It's unlike any you've ever faced. Robert's breath caught in his throat. He was no stranger to dangerous people. But this was different. This wasn't just about power or money. This was about control, and Dawson had it. Robert glanced at the folder. The weight of the decision hung heavy on his chest. He could feel his pulse in his ears. How much time do I have? He asked, his voice rough. Dawson didn't answer immediately. Instead, he moved behind Robert, placing a hand on the back of his chair, leaning in close. You'll do this on our timeline, Dawson said softly. Any delays, any hesitation, will only make things worse for you and your wife. Robert's heart skipped again. His mind flashed to her, Sarah, the woman who had been by his side through it all. Was she truly safe? The thought twisted inside him, pulling at his every instinct. Understood? Dawson's voice cut through his thoughts. Robert nodded slowly. Yeah, he said, his voice barely audible. Understood? Dawson let out a breath, as if releasing the tension that had been building. Good. He stepped away, moving to the table where the folder lay. Robert's hands clenched into fists, his body still stiff with pain and uncertainty. His mind was a mess, but the reality was clear now. He had no choice. This wasn't the life he had chosen, but it was the life he had to live now. Dawson slid the folder across the table to Robert. "Open it," he commanded. Robert took a deep breath, his hands shaking slightly as he reached for it. Inside, the names and details were laid out clearly. But the very first name on the list, the one that made Robert's stomach churn, was someone he knew all too well. Someone he thought he'd left behind. Someone he'd betrayed years ago. And now, this person was the key to it all. Robert's eyes widened. The game was far more personal than he'd ever imagined. Dawson watched his reaction, an unreadable expression on his face. "You didn't think this was just about money, did you, Kent?" Robert felt the walls closing in. This wasn't just a job anymore. It was revenge. A twisted, relentless kind of revenge. And Robert was in the center of it all. Robert sat in the dimly lit room, the folder in front of him. The names inside burned into his mind. But it wasn't the names that unsettled him. It was the one at the top, the one he knew would change everything. He'd crossed paths with this person years ago, back when he was still a man of principle, before the lies, before the betrayals, before he became the man Dawson had turned him into. He could still remember the day it all changed. The day his past, his choices, had come back to haunt him. The day the name on that list had been the end of his redemption. But now, the name was his mission, a mission he couldn't refuse. And as Dawson stood across from him, eyes cold and calculating, Robert knew this was the last chance to walk away. But the cost of walking away was too high. The weight of Sarah's life, of his own, was too much to risk. Dawson had his grip on Robert, and he wasn't letting go. "You see, Kent," Dawson began, his voice low, almost intimate. "You were never meant to be free. We've been grooming you for this." Robert's eyes shot up, disbelief flickering across his face. "Grooming me?" Dawson smiled, but it wasn't a pleasant one. "We knew your potential. We knew what you could do." Robert clenched his fists, the weight of the truth crashing down on him. "You were always a tool, a weapon. And now, you'll do what we say, or we'll destroy everything you care about." The words hit harder than any bullet. Dawson wasn't just a man pulling strings. He was the puppet master. Robert had been playing right into his hands. But now, he had to play one last hand, one that could make or break him. He stared at the name on the paper again, and for the first time he realized the truth. He was never going to escape, not without a cost, and that cost might be his very soul. Robert sat back in his chair, the weight of Dawson's words pressing on his chest. The room felt smaller, the air thicker. His mind raced, torn between the past and the present, between the man he used to be and the man he had become. The flash drive, the mission, the name at the top of the list. It was all leading to something inevitable, something irreversible. Dawson's gaze never left him, the silence between them stretching longer with each passing second. Robert took a deep breath, forcing himself to calm his nerves. This was it, the moment of no return. "All right," Robert said finally, his voice steady but hollow. "I'll do it." Dawson's lips curled into a thin, almost imperceptible smile. "Good choice, Kent," he said. "But remember, this is a one-way road." Robert's throat tightened, but he didn't flinch. He had no other choice. Dawson leaned in, handing him a small key card. "Everything you need is in the file. You report to us from now on, and you follow the orders exactly. No mistakes." Robert nodded, accepting the card. He felt the heavy weight of the folder in his hands, knowing that once he opened it, there would be no turning back. "This isn't just about you anymore," Dawson continued, his tone dropping into something darker. "Your every move will be watched. Every step you take, every breath you make, it's all under our control now." Robert swallowed hard, the finality of the situation settling deep in his bones. "Understood," he whispered. Dawson's smile widened, but there was no warmth in it. "Good." As he turned to leave, Robert remained seated, staring at the folder in his hands. The walls seemed to close in around him, the weight of the choices he had made, of everything he had lost, crushing him. He had been a man of power, a man of secrets, But now, he was nothing more than a tool, a pawn in a game he couldn't win. The door clicked shut behind Dawson, leaving Robert alone in the dimly lit room. The silence was deafening, and as he opened the folder, he knew he had sealed his fate. The story of Robert Kent was over, but the story of the man he had become, that had only just begun.